for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is radio broadcast number 467, November the 16th, 1980. It will be 17 years this week since John Kennedy was assassinated, November 22nd, 1963. There's a whole new generation of young people growing up who barely remember the incident at all and have been brought up in the school system to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald shot John Kennedy. There is a lot of discrepancy on that conclusion, the official government conclusion, but the news media continues to perpetuate the story, for the most part, that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. As many of you know, I began my research in that time period, 2 days after Kennedy was assassinated, when Jack Ruby stepped up and shot a man named Lee Harvey Oswald in the Dallas jail. If that was Oswald and not a double. We had never seen Oswald before, so we were told that was Lee Harvey Oswald, and there are even discrepancies in those conclusions through the past 17 years that continue to this day. We've seen a lot of murders since Kennedy was killed, political assassinations, a lot of mediocrity in the White House, a lot of media silence, and now we end up with the moral majority. It's pretty sickening to study this thing for 17 years and see the progression of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, and then Gerald Ford, and now Ronald Reagan in the White House, Jimmy Carter as an interim president because Reagan was selected a long time ago, and the full assassination team is in power now, as they were as soon as Kennedy was killed, and have control of all the major agencies which they usurped at that time and took for themselves to control us or the world in any way that they wanted. There was a conference this last week in Los Angeles of scholars and people from the New Frontier. 40 members of the New Frontier gathered for a 2-day conference at the University of Southern California to examine John Kennedy's social, foreign affairs, civil rights, and military programs. And it was the first time they had been there to discuss the policies of John Kennedy that were made 20 years ago, and came to the conclusion that he was the last U.S. chief with a vision of the future. Several people spoke there. Roger Hilsman was former director of the State Department, Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and people from the Pentagon, arms control agencies, disarmament agencies, and so forth were there lecturing. It's a shame that they've been quiet for 17 years about who killed John Kennedy, and they can look at him posthumously while the effect of that murder still reaches all of us. He was the last U.S. chief with a vision, and these men are too short-sighted to continue that vision and make a future for us, reverse the trend of mediocrity and thievery and murder from the White House on down. These people don't have the courage to do anything but study it academically and not get into the hard evidence, even the recent House Select Committee on Assassinations, or the question of whether Lee Harvey Oswald is even in that grave in Texas, the problem of exhuming that body. It's really a tragedy that these scholars on the John Kennedy era don't have the guts to find out why the dreams and visions and the programs ended on November 22nd, 1963. I'm studying the new Reagan cabinet, the cronies he's had. I've had many, many files on Ronald Reagan through these years in public office as governor, aspiring to become president of the United States, and it requires a tremendous amount of research. And of course, now that he's choosing a cabinet, I have to go through all the articles that come out that are pertinent to various subjects on Ronald Reagan and study those carefully and learn a whole new team of men, their backgrounds. And even though we've seen them before, such as Mr. Casey with his employment by Robert Besco and his role as the Security Exchange Commission at the time of Watergate, and we've heard many of the names through the Watergate era, we must redefine them and where they've been since Nixon was kicked out of office, where they've been in the past years in intelligence operations and what is going to be their role in the future. I'm studying the various people working with Ronald Reagan that are prominent in the news that were part of the Kennedy assassination team, such as Gerald Ford and John Connally. I study the big changes that are happening through the administration. I'll read off some of those, that just items in the news in the past week that are enough to scare any of us in intent of changing occupational safety rules or rules for the industry, the factory owners to take away benefits for workers and lower wages and so forth. The clean air bills to be negated and tested for a year. No regulations of any kind for health, safety, and otherwise. I have a large category on George Bush and the CIA appointments for his cabinet that he's making now, people that worked in the CIA with him, so that if anything happens to Ronald Reagan, the entire cabinet of George Bush would be CIA. And then we have to learn the new names of the Reagan cabinet, even though they were with him in the past or in California, they move into Washington, and these names will become familiar, some of them from Watergate, like General Haig and Richard Allen and Mr. Casey, and there are many, many others. I have brought some files here, Mr. Weinberger, Caspar Weinberger, and I can run down some of those names for you. I have a section on the church and what they expect from Ronald Reagan. He came in saying he owed the election to no particular group, but the moral majority and the far right are very vocal, and they're very displeased with his appointments because so far they come from the Ford-Nixon administration, and the likes of Henry Kissinger and George Shultz are much too liberal. And the far right wing, I guess as far right as Adolf Hitler, feel that he's selling them out, and they've said quite clearly in the newspaper they are very displeased. And then we'll watch the role of Ronald Reagan not only with the church, but with the new Pope. Those of you who have my tapes a while back when John Paul II became the Pope, remember the research that I did and the conclusion based on the research that John Paul II worked at Auschwitz during the concentration camp period, worked for I.G. Farben, the company that made the chemical that was doing the exterminations. And now the Pope was in Germany just this week asking for the two Germanys to be united, and he also works with the labor leaders in Poland. There's an article of his interference in the labor strikes. He is not a Pope that simply tends to the religion of the Catholics, but he's one of the most political popes since the popes at the time of Nazi Germany and during the Spanish Civil War. I'm studying the people in Congress that were removed, and of course the new committees that are taking over and the power they'll have, and their links to past political assassinations. And there are many articles in the newspaper on the effect of Ronald Reagan's administration on South Africa, on Argentina. He doesn't believe in interfering with civil rights or the human rights, and those governments should be allowed to do what they want. There's another group, in addition to the church, the Heritage Foundation and Richard Voggery, the far right. Again, Voggery was an instrument of Young Americans for Freedom in the Southwest, and he moved to Washington to clean out the congressmen that they have targeted, to get rid of them systematically until they get the kind of Congress that elected Adolf Hitler in 1933. The far right is very active, they're very vocal, they're well organized, and they're funded with as much money as they could possibly have. And then, of course, we have to watch the excuse of terrorism to take over the FBI and the CIA. There were articles just today in the Sunday paper, many of you probably saw it, that in Ronald Reagan's administration, the FBI should again be allowed to do black bags, burglary, open the mail, doesn't have to have permission of the president or the attorney general. They can have illegal entry and clandestine activities, that they should unleash the CIA and turn us back to the Nixon era or the LBJ era and get us back to the time where we had absolutely no privacy and we were photographed and so forth. That will happen to the intelligence community. Also, the control of the media is going to escalate. Claire Luce is giving lectures at the colleges. She's the widow of Henry Luce of Time, Life, and Fortune, crying about the prosecution of two FBI agents for illegal entry and making heroes out of them. Claire Luce is a very active media person, and Radio Free Europe and the large towers from the Christian Council, the Vatican Radio Tower, which is the most powerful in the world, will begin increasing beaming anti-communist radio talks over the radio. And the think tanks are another section that I've separated. I've talked briefly on this program about the Hoover Institute, and I'll bring up some information about the George Washington University and the effect it's going to have on the Reagan administration. Right now, they're glad to have very few people from Harvard. The think tanks will supply, as they have supplied the speeches for Ronald Reagan, they'll supply the actions and the thinkers, and I'm going into one of those particular ones in a few minutes. And then, of course, there's the transition team, and I will be doing from time to time broadcasts and biographies of people helping him with the transition team, always keeping in mind their links to the past political murders and assassinations that made it possible for Ronald Reagan to be president in 1980. One example of an advisor for the transition team is Evel Younger, the former Attorney General of California, who was the key man in the interstate national link from the Los Angeles Police Department up through California to Washington, what Louis Tackwood called the Gestapo. The Chief of Police Ed Davis wanted an Evel Younger. Evel Younger is now advising Ronald Reagan on justice and security. I believe that someday he will be suggested either as a justice of the Supreme Court or the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was the district attorney in Los Angeles when Robert Kennedy was killed at the Ambassador Hotel. He said that he'd leave no stone unturned on the story of Sirhan. The trial involved hypnotizing Sirhan and telling him how he killed Robert Kennedy. Dr. Diamond did that, where the actual fatal bullets came from Thane Caesar standing in back of Robert Kennedy, and Sirhan didn't fire the fatal bullets into Robert Kennedy at all. Evel Younger was not interested in pursuing the investigation. He covered it up. As he went on to be the Attorney General of California from the DA in Los Angeles. He has a long list of military credentials. He's on the reserve. He's high up in the United States military and the FBI and the intelligence community. And Ed Davis, his cohort of the LAPD, who was there through all of the violence and COINTEL programs going on through the entire state of California, is now a senator in California. Another area that I'll be watching, in addition to the people who are involved in the assassination teams, are the Watergate people, because they overlap and are part of the assassination teams. G. Gordon Liddy has become a college hero. He's been written up in all the newspapers lately. He's a smart aleck guy who tells how he would kill his own son and brags about his ability to kill and his willingness to kill. And all of a sudden, this Watergate person is surfacing as a very camp college leader, going around at $3,000 a lecture with hundreds of lectures in advance, making a fortune and becoming a folk hero in that he's willing to die or kill to stop what he calls communism. And, of course, it was Gerald Ford from the Warren Commission, appointed by Richard Nixon to investigate the murder of John Kennedy, who brought G. Gordon Liddy to Washington, D.C., to the Treasury Department at a time when the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms had assassination teams set up within that office. G. Gordon Liddy was an FBI man from New York, Westchester, New York, and I believe it was, who came to Washington, the Treasury Department, and fit right in with E. Howard Hunt and the CIA teams. The group that were involved in the murder of John Kennedy incorporated Liddy into future assassination teams. And as I say, he's very open about his willingness to die, and the new young generation think he's just groovy. He's a hero because he went to jail, kept his mouth shut, and he's willing to kill and die as a symbol of what he believes in. Now, whether you're right, left, or middle, no matter what your political party is, I repeat again that this new moral majority, this new far right, this new G. Gordon Liddy, they may have the mentality of Adolf Hitler, but they have the genius to strike at the nerve of people who want something to believe in. They want anything. Howdy Doody is gone a long time ago. Captain Kangaroo isn't doing it. The space shows won't do it. Television isn't going to supply the heroes the people need, and they'll latch on to anything if there is no substitute. And there are no believable people in society out there trying to make it better that are visual, that are invited to the campuses to inspire other people to something better than killing and assassinations. And being as there's a vacuum, and there's only G. Gordon Liddy, they go to hear him, and they're eating it up. They love it. There's an article in a newspaper today and several papers that I get on Sunday about a woman, a writer, a journalist, reminded me a little bit above myself, although I have never had the experiences she's had. She wrote a book called A Man, published by Simon & Schuster, and her name is Oriana Fallaci, Fallaci. And the man she wrote her book about is Alexander Panagoulis, Panagoulis. She's Italian, she's a journalist, and she has a large home in Italy and one in France, an apartment in New York. But according to these articles, she locked herself into a room no larger than a prison cell where she stayed for 3 years to write about her friend Alexander. She met him in Greece. He was murdered by the Greek military junta. He had gone to jail for charges of trying to kill the leader of the Greek military regime that was put into power by our CIA in 1967. And when he got out of jail, he was in a car accident that she said was murder. And she described his life under the Nazi dictatorship. She said, I have never lived under Nazi dictatorship or the Greek military junta, but she got to know him after he was released from jail. She was doing a story about him, and she began to understand what he had endured in the way of torture and in prison in Greece. Now, the CIA had used our Office of Management budget and Roy Ash of Litton Industries as a cover for the Greek military junta in 1967, and that was the first time that Nazis were put back into power in Greece since World War II. A few years later, 6 or 7 years later, the junta was overthrown, but it's still a very traditional government over there now. Now, she has been alerting the readers, according to the book review, story of her book, to authoritarian people around the world. And she felt that Alexander was her boyfriend, that she fell in love with him and was going to marry him, was a Greek poet. But he not only wrote poetry, he was part of the resistance against the Greeks. And I forewarn you now that no matter what your profession is, whoever is listening to me now, there's going to be a time where you're going to have to either give in or form a resistance to what is going to come down under the Reagan administration. And she points out that even though he was a poet, he decided to make some attempt to express his anger, and he was charged with trying to assassinate George Papadopoulos, the military strongman in Greece. They released him in 1973, arranged an accident. She said he was run down by a Greek Nazi because he knew too much, and this person went on to become very wealthy and got promotions and so forth. Her uncle, it was a journalist, and encouraged her to write, this Fallaci, and she said that when she started writing, she felt she had an obligation not to swallow whole what people in power told her, that she became curious and traveled around and decided to be outspoken against what she considered injustice. And I suppose when I started my research 17 years ago, this coming 22nd of November, which is just 6 days away, I made up my mind that I would not swallow what people in power told me, and that I would try to find out if there was an injustice in this case, if Lee Harvey Oswald was framed and did in fact kill the president, or if somebody else did it who is out there free, enjoying the fruits and getting promoted from this terrible murder. Now, she has gone on to say, I'm not a diplomat, I'm not a coward, and I'm not a hypocrite, but she accuses the left, the right, and center, and says, she said, you all murdered him. I don't belong to any party, she mentioned, and a university lecturer at Yale University. I'm not a political person, but when the time comes for struggle, you militants are going to sit at a desk, and there are others who are going to struggle and die. She as much as said, get off your ass. Somebody asked her about the murder of Allende in Chile, and she said to the Yale students, you can sit around and talk about it, but there's others who struggle and die. And then she said that she has interviewed people like Khomeini and Henry Kissinger and heads of states. She said, I have met the movers and shakers of the world, the bastards who decide our lives. And she was very pessimistic, according to this one book review, or two of them, about Western humanity. She feels it's sinking like the Roman Empire, that it hasn't much future. She said the license and abuse of freedom is a terrible aspect, it's a trouble aspect of America and Europe today. The West is eroded by passivity induced by television, decline in literacy, corruption of technology, and the breakdown of civility and humanism. And she summed up her relationship to many world leaders in 3 words, in quotes, barbarians, barbarians, barbarians. And she also said, I am not a coward, I shall never be. Her book is a bestseller in Italy. She didn't believe that it would be on the newsstands in Greece more than 48 hours. But this is a woman who covered the war stories in Vietnam, who knew a person who was tortured and confined for what he believed in Greece. He was able to get out of jail and then was run down by a man that was a known Nazi. And she's written a book, A Man. And she said she wrote it because she wanted you to know the name Alexander Panagoulis. That there are no heroes, there are no people to look up to, and this is a man who lived and wrote and tried, and he was murdered, and his message and her message should live on. I think of that conference at University of Southern California of the people from the frontier, the great frontier, and the new frontier of John Kennedy assembling down there and talking about his goals and aims, but sitting comfortable in their chairs, no doubt an air-conditioned conference room for 2 days to talk about John Kennedy, but not one single one of those cowards would roll up their sleeves and spend 1 hour to try and find out who killed him. I'm sure they get tax deductions for the conference, but they don't want to know who killed their fallen leader. I mentioned last week the funding of the far right, because the Nazi movement and the far right has endless money for going around publishing literature, weapons, killing, and looting, and it takes a lot of hidden money because the budget of the CIA would be exposed even though they have billions of dollars that aren't accounted for. Somebody might spill the beans, so that the illegal money, the passing of weapons, goes through all kinds of surreptitious activities. And I mentioned several weeks ago that Nugan Hand Bank in Australia, where $50 million is missing, and is involved in the Central Intelligence Agency and the Paisley murder, John Paisley murder, and the Russian department, the area that Lee Harvey Oswald worked with. Along those lines, there was another article this week about a Paris thief, a set of thieves that got $12 million. Now, this last week, November the 4th, there was an article, Weekend Burglars, using the slogan of a famous French robber, emptied 250 safe deposit boxes in a Paris bank and took $12 million. They went to a wealthy district and took out of these safe deposits $12 million, and they left slogans on the wall, in quotes, without hate, without arms, without violence, thanks, they wrote on the wall. Now, this happened in Nice, France, in 1976. A man named Albert Spaghiari escaped. He took $10 million out of safe deposits and vaults in Nice. The police had him in their office, and he was caught in 1977, and he, in quotes, escaped. And he said he was using this money for Nazi money to rearm and for the resurgence of Nazis. Now, there is a lot of missing money. If you take $12 million from Paris last weekend and $50 million from the Nugan Hand Bank, and you add up the missing millions, this is going on all over the world, and I began to notice that a couple of years ago, how much money was going into right-wing causes that would be impossible to do without help of the police or the local authorities. And maybe one of the first things that tuned me into that was the declaration of Albert Spaghieri that he was a Nazi, that it was going for right-wing causes in 1976. So I began a file on missing money, not 2 million or 4 million, but millions of dollars that are floating around the world to fund armies for counterintelligence to put down labor movements or riots if they take place when the going gets tough. There was another case in Switzerland. This was in June 10th this year, where a French bank was missing money. It's a court case of Mr. Pincus and his wife, Florence Pincus. She was living in a hotel in Cannes on the French Riviera. She had divorced her husband, but they were in contact every day. And he had money in the Citibank in New York, the First National Bank in Minneapolis. He had $3.5 million that he took from the Citibank in New York. He had $3.5 million that he took from Minneapolis. And he had even more millions. It was called the Pincus Affair. And he put it in the third largest bank in Switzerland, the Credit Suisse, which was missing millions of dollars several years ago on another case. And all of a sudden, this man took cyanide. According to one portfolio of false documents, he had more than $140 million from various banks. $140 million. He took cyanide, and he talked to his wife on the telephone, his ex-wife down in Kansas, and she took cyanide, and the two of them died just within a short time of each other. He instructed her on how to take her cyanide, so that was $140 million gone from there, $50 million from the Nugan Bank in Australia, from noticeably and identified positively with the CIA, $12 million last weekend from Paris, from a safe deposit, leaving notes of thank you. So you begin to add that up, and if you parlay that into weapons and narcotics, roughly that's about $202 million just from 3 incidences that have happened linked to right-wing causes and so forth. I got a letter from Charles Spears from Texas this last week when I was talking about the Nugan Hand affair. He was responding. He's a researcher in Texas, the president of a bank who keeps a chronicle on these affairs and world affairs, past, present, and future. And he wrote to me, "May deductive reasoning, sequence logic, and intuition tell me that the biggest thing you're getting into in 17 years is the millions and even billions of hard right dollars around the world and back again, collected secretly for power, control, action, and terrorism." And he's absolutely of the conclusion that the CIA has hundreds of millions of annual drug trade dollars, that the missing $600 million of the Vatican funds is parlayed into this group, and he mentioned $120 million lost from the Howard Hughes organization, $45 million from the Franklin National Bank that Michael Sindona took, linked to the Vatican, and the Vatican lost millions and millions of dollars. So when you begin to add this up and you say, where is the money going? It is going to arms and far-right organizations such as the very extreme group that are behind Ronald Reagan's administration, and the team that have put this group together are using this money and will use it to get their goal. Their goal specifically, a war against the Soviet Union. Their second goal, to turn the entire world Christian. They've already proclaimed that. John Connolly and Leon Jaworski and Gerald Ford, Clint Murchison, the entire Watergate, Nixon, Ford gang down in Texas declared that is one of their goals. Clement Stone from Chicago, to turn the entire world Christian, and they will take this 50, 60, 100, 200 million and begin radio towers and propaganda and get politicians in until they get their goal. That doesn't leave much leeway for ordinary citizens who may not want to be Christian or happen to be white or black, rather, or minorities, or people who want to improve their lot in life, and the education is getting expensive, and there's no housing and there's no food, and this money will go into SWAT teams and the Klan and the Nazi organizations to keep them down. It will supply the arms, the paramilitary, to keep the mob quiet as the sources of their income are cut off. There's nowhere to live, and their fuel expenses are high, and the squeeze begins to come down. This money will go into the arms to keep them down. This is the end of the first 30 minutes. I'm going to take a 1-minute break, and then we'll continue with side 2 or part 2 of World Watchers.
This concludes the first.
Watchers International over FM 102 KLRB. And now back to Mae Brussell.
The Associated Press had a story today that the Heritage Foundation is advising Ronald Reagan that we've never had so much chaos in this country or threat to internal security to the Republic since World War II. They're suggesting that he take a hard line against domestic radicals, that they revive the Congressional Internal Security Committee, that they influence conservative research groups, and they have a blueprint to step up activities. They want to go against the radicals, the New Left, the anti-defense, the anti-nuclear lobbies. They also mentioned the white racists like the Ku Klux Klan. There's no mention of the American Nazi Party. This is the article I mentioned before that asked that they stop restricting opening mail by the FBI, that they don't need the approval of the president or the attorney general for break-ins, and that no groups in political organizations can be investigated unless they're suspected of criminal activity. And of course, the catch-22 there is that it's not criminal if it's national security. So you can expect a lot of excitement in the near future, and also I believe there'll be a Reichstag kind of operation to convince Ronald Reagan that there is chaos. At the time of the SWAT team emerging during our dinner hour to show their new expertise when the SLA were burned in Los Angeles, the headlines a few weeks later said SWAT teams will be needed for food riots. As I say, when the food gets too high, when people are unemployed and you put a lid on new employment and you have no low-cost housing, that's one of the new restrictions they want to take away, is demanding that the builders provide low-cost housing and so forth. When you have no housing and no food and no transportation and no medical care, you can expect riots, and these people want to be prepared. There's nothing going on out in the streets such as they're describing, but they will create the need and then say, see, we told you so. There have been a lot of articles, as I say, on Ronald Reagan's think tanks, the two of them, the Hoover Institute and the Georgetown University. I want to talk about one of the people at Georgetown University who's helping Ronald Reagan get his committee and his Congress together, not his Congress, but his cabinet and advisors. Georgetown is pleased. They have 15 advisors, as I say, from their school, 22 from Stanford. The director, the man who's helping, the expert on strategic studies at Georgetown University, is Edward N. Lutwak, Luttwak. He was trained at the London School of Economics and Johns Hopkins, and he has been talking about advising Ronald Reagan. He first was an advisor to Howard Baker of the CIA, and now he's advising Ronald Reagan on foreign and defense policy, and he's become the expert for the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. You'll see that CSIS a lot in the news from now on. It is a think tank that produced two-thirds of Ronald Reagan's advisors, and they're in Washington, D.C. on 18th Street. And Lutwak, according to the Washington Post, wrote a book on the strategy of the Roman Empire and an analysis of current defense capability. Now, it's interesting that the Washington Post attributes Lutwak's expertise to the strategy of the Roman Empire, but they didn't mention that he wrote a book called Coup d'Etat in America. The minute I saw his name helping Ronald Reagan, I recognized Edward Lutwak, and while certain people thought of him as a folk hero when Coup d'etat came out in 1969, I realized that he was somebody to be afraid of. I think it was Penn Jones in Texas who thought, oh, Coup d'etat is a great book, and everybody talked about Coup d'etat. Lutwak wrote a practical handbook on how to overthrow countries. The book, the table of contents, what is a coup d'etat? When is it possible? The strategy of the coup d'etat, the planning, the execution, the economics of repression. He's from Georgetown University. Now, I thought it was interesting. He wrote this in 1969 when the United States had its coup d'etat in 1963, November 22nd. But he never mentioned the assassination of John Kennedy. In this book, The Coup d'etat, he said he has a section on how to take over a nation, and it's described in the cover as a cold-blooded detail, the whole strategy of taking over a country. Every step of the takeover is covered, from a preliminary look at modern states to the final triumphant entry into a capital whose airports have been closed, whose leaders have been arrested if not already recruited, whose police and military are neutralized, whose population has been left with no course but to accept the fait accompli. Oh, Coup d'etat in America was the book by A.J. Weberman on the assassination of John Kennedy. Coup d'etat is the book by Lutwak, put out by Alfred Knopf in 1969. In this book, he says every stage of planning and action is worked out on what to do, when to do it, and how, and the methods of sounding out your minimum risk, your timing, your intelligence, and so forth. Lutwak was born in Transylvania. I thought that was where Dracula came from. I guess they both were from there. Educated in Italy and Britain, London School of Economics, studied in the Middle East, East and West, and then shows up as one of the leaders at Georgetown University as an advisor to Ronald Reagan. In his book, he lists certain coups d'etats that took place from 1945 to 1967. Now, that was the time period right after World War II when the OSS became instrumental and began to get their muscles, and then the CIA was formed by 1947 with the help of Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence. And then the United States was gung-ho from 47 up to the present day. There was a coup in Guinea-Bissau just this week, yesterday, that I want to go into. But in coup d'etat, he describes the coup in Algeria. Now, every one of these coups was a right-wing military coup with the assistance of the United States in Algeria in 1964, Burundi in 1958, and in 66, the Central African Republic in 1965, the Congo in 58, the Congo in 1964. One was the Brazzaville Congo, and the other was the Kinshasa. Egypt in 1965, that's when Sadat took over from Nasser. Ghana in 1965, Nigeria 1965, Rwanda in 58, Sierra Leone in 65, Sudan in 65, Togo in 65. See, John Kennedy and the coup took place in 1963, almost before 1964. But Burma was 1963. These were the successful coups d'etats, and he became an expert and wrote a book on how to do it. He has the right-wing faction in Laos in 64, in Nepal, Thailand, the army factions, in Vietnam Republic, November 1st, 1963. That was 30 days before John Kennedy was murdered, when Diem was murdered in Southeast Asia by our government. He has murders in Iraq, the coup in 1963, Lebanon, Syria, Africa, and he goes into various countries and coups d'etats. And he has not only been an expert on this, the one in Thailand in 1965, the Vietnam Republic in 1965, Korea in 1965, and their various struggles. Argentina, the coup in 1965, Bolivia in 58, Brazil, he has 65, actually it was in 1964, right after Kennedy was murdered. The Dominican Republic and Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru. All of these coups d'etats are listed with the dates I once had a figure of 77 countries that the United States had been instrumental in putting military dictatorships in, and we hear about the Soviet Union's influence in Cuba and the necessity to overturn all of Central America. These few dinky little islands have a communist form of government, and now Jamaica is far right-wing, and it belongs to Ronald Reagan and a Harvard graduate. These coups are listed in this book, Coup d'etat. We don't have to list all of the countries for you, the 77. Edouard Lutwak, the practical handbook on how to do a military takeover so the people are left totally immobilized. That's what happened to us November 22nd, 1963, and now he is from the Georgetown think tank sending advisors to Ronald Reagan. They knew how to do it, and they did it really good. One of the things that I mentioned rather angrily, and you'll hear me being angry many times or disgusted, was the passivity of the so-called left and the Kennedy team, or the non-voters, the 50% that didn't vote in this last election, or the so-called liberals behind miserable scumbags like Javits in New York, the liberal behind Jan Anderson. I can't imagine where these people are coming from, but there is no left in this country. It's been completely annihilated. There will be radical, angry people out in the streets someday, but there is no organized left. As I say, if there's anything, it's an intellectual group that sit at the desks, such as those that attended the conference on John Kennedy and his vision and goals, and not one of those, the Schlesingers and Salingers and the Bill Moyers and the whole gang of people that look like they are concerned thinkers, are complete washouts to facing the reality of what happened in this country. I much more respect a far right-wing conservative than a jelly-belly liberal who sees both sides but doesn't believe in anything. An example of that, going from Reagan's advisor, Lutwak, to a person who recognizes some of the realities, is the other side of the coin, a man, Medgar Evans, graduate of Yale, a member of the Birch Society, wrote a book called The Usurpers. Some of his theories are wrong, not all of them are right, but in apropos or in conjunction with the anniversary of Kennedy's death, I'm not going to read you what the so-called left or Kennedy friends wrote. All of the books they wrote don't even touch the murder. But it took Medgar Evans from the far right wing to write about the coup in 1963. He wrote in The Usurpers about Dean Rusk, Walter Rostow, Robert McNamara, Clark Clifford, Abe Fortas, and Nicholas Katzenbach. And I want to read a few pages from his book, The Usurpers. He said, at some time after November 5th, 1968, that was the election when Richard Nixon was won the nomination and won the election in November of 68, we will know whether the usurpers of the type who are operating the present administration are to continue in power or to be replaced by establishment substitutes. We'll know if the usurpers win. Well, Richard Nixon won, and he was very much a part of that early assassination team. Medgar Evans wrote Chapter 2 of The Usurpers, The Coup d'etat of November 22nd, 1963. Now, Medgar Evans saw it. Why wouldn't Mr. Lutwak have seen in 69 that we had a coup d'etat in 63? This is what Medgar Evans wrote. Exactly who put Lyndon Baines Johnson into the White House in 63 is not known. The Warren Commission said it was Lee Harvey Oswald. Various persons, such as New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, author Mark Lane, disagree. Whoever killed John Kennedy evidently wanted Lyndon Johnson to become a president, and my book deals with well-established matters of fact and with certain obvious conjectures. Natural speculation is presented, but presented as speculation. It is a matter of fact that Lyndon Johnson failed to secure the nomination for president in 1960. It is a matter of reasonable conjecture that afterwards there was little chance of being nominated unless he achieved it through the president dying in office. It is a matter of fact that in November 1963, He had been vice president for 3 trying years with nothing to do except self-discipline and patience. And since the president in whose shadow Johnson served was 9 years younger, the odds were great that he would never become president unless Kennedy were killed. Indeed, there was some prospect in November 1963 that Johnson may not even continue to be vice president and would go to relative obscurity as being an ex-vice president. William Manchester referred to persistent reports that Johnson may be dumped off the ticket next year. Arthur Schlesinger wrote about it, and Johnson did not attend a meeting of high officials in November 63 to support this idea. He says, once we conclude, as so many reasonable writers have shown, that the report of the Warren Commission is inherently incredible, we can hardly suppress speculation that someone on the commission intended a deception. Now, John J. McCloy, one of the advisors to the interim team, he's 80 years old. The advisor to Ronald Reagan was on the Warren Commission. Gerald Ford was on the Warren Commission. Arlene Specter, a lawyer for the Warren Commission staff, has been elected to the Senate in Washington, D.C. Medgar Evans quoted Richard Rovere, a writer who said the commission's client was Lyndon Johnson, and the day the Warren report was issued, the American press should have begun to do what Mr. Edward Epstein did in writing a book. They should have cast a cool eye on the Warren report. Now, the American press didn't begin the day the report was out to examine it. I began, and other researchers began, but they didn't. What Medgar Evers wrote is, what is not speculation is that the death of John Kennedy affected a transfer of power in the United States. Every assassination of a chief of state is in effect a coup d'etat. A coup d'etat is not a revolution. It does not necessarily involve a change in ideology. It does not necessarily involve a change in bureaucracy or professional police. A coup d'etat is accomplished by someone already near the highest level. If an assassin is too far beneath his victim in the established power structure, he can't reap the fruit of his deed. The fruit will, however, be gathered. And I might add, the fruit of Leon Jaworski and John Connolly, another advisor, and Gerald Ford, with their riches and their prominence, has been gathered from their covering up this death. Medgar Evers went on, an assassin may not intend to seize power for himself. He may not be thinking in terms of power at all, but someone will be thinking in those terms. A coup d'etat, unlike a revolution, does not involve a large number of people. A coup d'etat such as the November 22nd, 1963, did involve hundreds of people, but that's not large when you think of 200 million in the United States. Its success depends on the majorities continuing to operate pretty much in their accustomed fashion. The pilot must be replaced with as little disturbance as possible to the passenger. On reflection, most people will believe that the assassination of John Kennedy, so difficult to execute, so dangerous to the murderer, must have been planned, and since the victim was President of the United States, few will doubt that the planners were politically motivated. America in general would not believe that, as Sergeant Shriver said, that people of Asia, Africa, and America would believe that the motivation was anything but supreme power. He said, there was a quotation of Shriver's, that's Kennedy's brother-in-law, about the killing of John Kennedy that he didn't agree with. Shriver said that Asia, Africa, and South America would assume that whoever had killed President Kennedy would now be president. He doesn't agree with that necessarily, but he has to say in reflection that in the United States, there are plays such as McBird, that was by Barbara Garson, or The Midlothian Mirror, that's Penn Jones' book and newspaper that he was publishing, that have suggested that the vice president was trying to catch the nearest way to the White House. Most Americans would no more suspect Lyndon Johnson of complicity in the assassination of John Kennedy than suspect Andrew Johnson in the complicity in the murder of Lincoln. Nevertheless, the political motivation by forces behind the scenes, behind Lyndon Johnson, the cabinet, the Pentagon, the Navy intelligence, the Defense Intelligence Agency, those behind the scenes cannot be dismissed, and those who accomplish the deed may well have intended the consequences. Many an American has thought as much, but hardly dared to dwell on the thought, much less speak out. The thought is repellent. And he says that it wasn't only Lyndon Johnson, the man who inherited the throne. That's why he disagreed with Shriver. He said it isn't just that one person who inherits it. It's the people behind that person. So Lyndon Johnson went off in disgrace down to his ranch and really was never seen publicly much after he was out of office in 1968. But the team that killed him stayed into power, and they're into power today. And Ronald Reagan's gang, the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon, the Hoover Institute, the think tanks, and the Georgetown University, those people all had a finger in the pie going back 17 years ago. Some of the younger people coming in didn't have a finger in that pie, but they did nothing ever to investigate it. And the point is that the old-timers, such as John Connally, Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon. Nixon was out on an atomic submarine this week, acting every bit the political man interested in the weapon systems and the military. The guy should have been sent to an island like Alba somewhere. He is taken out by the military and given a lot of dignity. Now, I mentioned briefly another coup, an interesting one, because this Richard Allen had a part as an agent in Portugal, and with problems in Africa at the time of trying to throw Portugal out of the colonies down there. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal about Richard Allen. And before the Reagan administration could take over, there was a military coup yesterday in Guinea-Bissau in West Africa. President Luis de Almeida Cabral was arrested and taken into custody. His brother was murdered a few years earlier, and this is just a little country. It may not mean much to you, Portuguese Guiana. It belonged to Portugal. They got their independence in 1974. It's about twice the size of New Jersey. But it's a country that has, in quotes, peanuts, and peanut oil is very important, palm oil, hides, a large deposit of bauxite, and traces of oil. This poor man was picked up by the military, taken off. His brother was murdered in 1973. He was the first president. His brother was murdered. And now the president has been taken off. There was a lot of guerrilla warfare in fighting the Portuguese, and Richard Allen had a big part in suppressing certain massacres down in Africa that involved Portugal. He was a lobbyist for Portugal. If the United States needs minerals, if it needs oil, if it needs hides, if it needs the bauxite, it's going to go in and take it. And you're going to see more military juntas, more coups coming in even before Ronald Reagan takes his oath of office. But once he's in, there will be a lot of it. The last week I mentioned, I don't want to get too far off some of these unpleasant subjects, but I did mention a book on the Nobel, the Russian Rockefellers, and the study of history of how we got, say, from the Civil War up to the Ronald Reagan period. There's a linear connection between events and people and agents that goes back to the way the world was shaped in terms of trade and business at the time of the American Civil War. I have a book in my library by Foster Rhea Dulles. He's the brother of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, two men that were so instrumental in setting up all the failures that we've had internationally and domestically over this whole era of the last 30 years. And he wrote a book on American diplomatic history from 1860 to 1900. Now, it's interesting that the brother of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles would write about this time period, because he wrote a book from the Civil War to the 20th century. It's called Prelude to World Power, and it's about the foundations that were laid after Lincoln's time period and Secretary of State William Seward in the intent to make the United States an international world power, trading and arousing imperialism that we never had had before, that we were going to stop France or Napoleon into Mexico, we're going to stop Spain, we're going to stop Great Britain. There seemed to be a fluctuating of power from Russia wanting to assist the North, the Union, and Abraham Lincoln to become industrialized to compete with Great Britain and Spain and France. And then after Lincoln was killed, the Tsar was killed, and Britain and France and England could control pretty much the trade routes. And after the Russian Revolution and World War I, the empires, the royalty began to rearm again to keep down any expansion of Russia or to stop the promotion of the ideas that the Russian Marxists had taken on, that they might possibly spread around the world. And so the monarchies and the wealthy countries began to put in Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, hoping that the dictators would keep a handle on these obstinate new Soviets who came out with a new idea of dividing up the means of employment and the ownership of the factories by the people. The work of the Russians at the time of Abraham Lincoln's administration and the death of the leaders in Russia and the United States affected a lot of the policy that's going on today. We were starting out right at that time to expand and become an empire, and that's the thing we were never taught in school, at least I was never taught, was the diplomatic history such as the 1860s to 1900 that set the framework for World War I in 1914, for World War II that we entered in 1941, but actually began in 1939 when Hitler went into Poland. But the seeds of it were laid much earlier. These wars, World War I, II, and III, were planted, and the idea of them of grabbing empire or territory was always in the minds of a few people. And those who go out and fight, if they survive, they join the American Legion. If they die, they can't talk anyway. The only difference between those wars and the next one is the atomic proliferation, or the chance of the wars in space, or the laser beams and the weapon systems that are going to be, they are developed now, that are going to be deployed. We're working with a bunch of idiots, I believe, who don't know what they're doing or why, except they have it in their head that they have to make war, and they have to make war against Russia. And those are the people that I'll be discussing for weeks and weeks to come, members of Ronald Reagan's cabinet from the Georgetown University, from Harvard, from the Hoover Institute, the proliferation of weapons, the reduction of domestic programs, the curtailing of things that are going on that would benefit us, and how these people have run a thread, like John J. McCloy, Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger. They never faded away or died away. They had unlimited funds. They stayed powerful. They stayed in the media, and they're going to affect our lives until at some point we hurt enough, if we feel anything at all, to speak out and cry out, and if we don't feel it, we won't know the difference anyway. But it's a dismal future with the advisors that Reagan has, but it's something that we'll continue to study, and I'll be harping on it a lot because it goes back again to the assassination of John Kennedy, where many of these people were employed either as part of the assassination team or the cover-up. Well, another week has gone by. You take care. Next week or the week after is Thanksgiving. Have some good holidays, because by next Sunday I won't be able to reach some of you in the East by then. Continue to study and read your books and keep in touch, and I'll be back with you next week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell.